I'm Stuart Gerson, and I am the last panel. And there's some significant advantages in being the last panel of one, because there isn't going to be any disagreement. On the other hand, I start with a point of reference going all the way back to the very beginning of this evening's proceedings. I thought that the panels discussing questions of the role of the rule of law in the election, it wasn't a question that they were asking the wrong question. It was the fact that their analysis was somewhat deficient, in my view, because they didn't ask the right question. The panel discussing the rule of law and the election itself took a very Ptolemaic view of things, and the United States was the center of the universe and really the only point of reference. But the fact of the matter is, to take a Copernican view of things, this trend towards authoritarianism is a worldwide phenomenon now, and what we see in the United States, this tendency, why, I wrote a paper when I was an undergraduate about Russia entitled, "Why Does a Good People Select the Bad Government?" And we see throughout the world, in Turkey, we see a lifetime president in China, Sweden, where anti-immigration fervor is easily seen and the government is much more rigid. The same sorts of phenomena that we see in the United States. So when you look at this election, I think you have to ask the question, first have an understanding, as someone described. I'm going to explain, at least in my view, why rule of law issues are extremely important as we go forward. But at the same time, I suggest they played almost no role in the decisions made with regard to the re-election of Donald Trump. And I think you need to ask the question, when you make that analysis, what are the data telling you about this election? Donald Trump got essentially the same percentage of the vote that he got in 2016. There was substantial movement away, though, from traditional Democratic constituencies to get Donald Trump to the level that he got at. And you have to ask why. I mean, I've argued that Donald Trump essentially was elected by two groups: white, well-educated college women, I'll come back to them, college graduate women, and Hispanic males. And if you look at all the places where those groups are significant, you find most of the 1% to 3% difference in the Trump sweep of all 7 battleground states. So I think we need to ask the fundamental question. Let me cast a little shade on my reputation. I've been involved in presidential elections since 1960. And someone mentioned Pennsylvania early on. I was a citizen of Pennsylvania. When I was in college, I helped my friend Ray Schaefer, who became governor of Pennsylvania. I was active in Bill Scranton's presidential campaign. I'm that old. I know Pennsylvania pretty well. I represented my friend John Hines for years when he was chairman of the National Senatorial Campaign Committee. I was the outside general counsel of that, so going into this, I knew Pennsylvania, and like one of our early speakers, I announced the importance of Pennsylvania and the fact that the election likely could come down to Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania, the election would be decided by white, well-educated women. And I was absolutely correct, except they didn't vote for the Democratic candidate, which I had suggested. The majority of them voted for Donald Trump. And the same thing was true in a lot of other places. So we need to ask ourselves the fundamental question when we look at this is, what are the data telling us? Well, success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. In this election, failure is not only an orphan, but it's got 1,000 excuses. And the only two that seem to me to hold any water, at least that are supported by the data, I mean, you can make the general argument that the leadership of the Democratic Party doesn't speak to the constituency that they claim to represent. I think there's a lot of validity to that. But looking behind the data, what do we know for sure? This was another one just where the Bill Clinton philosophy obtained, and it's the economy, stupid. The sample after sample suggests that the shifting of minority voters to the Republican side had a great deal to do with the fact that while the economy had been improving, grocery prices, gasoline prices, and other consumer prices were nowhere near back to what they were in the pre-COVID times. The most successful political commercial that ran over 30,000 times during the campaign was the one involving the gender treatment for prisoners. It had a tremendous effect, and like it or not, it was probably the most effective commercial since we ran the Dukakis in the tank commercial in 1988. So I suggest we need to look at those things when we're analyzing this election and what it is that the people are telling us that they want. But we also need to look at these questions of the role of the rule of law, and that's what the organization sponsoring this, of which I'm proud to be one of the founders and officers, are about. We're about the rule of law, and we're going to see these issues. I was very much taken by what Don McGowan had to say concerning the role and the structure of the Justice Department. I served in a rather unique position. There have been a lot of people who've been acting attorney generals over time. Peter Keisler, who's here, is another one besides me. But there were two things about it. It's not an achievement. I didn't ask for it, and it had nothing to do with what I wanted to do. But I was the acting attorney general for the longest time anybody had ever been the acting attorney general. And I was the acting as attorney general for a president of the opposite party. And it all comes to mind. I mean, you know, I started out, I was an acolyte of President George H.W. Bush. We had a social relationship. We knew each other very well. I was his debate coach in the 1988 campaign. I knew all sorts of things that he was interested in, and we talked regularly outside of government stuff. But then when I was head of the civil division, the Iraq War came onto the scene, and we had a direct relationship, and I'd known something about war powers and had written in the area, and so I was asked to take the laboring oar for the department with regard to defense of President's war powers and challenges like Dellum's against Bush and the like of that. And of course, I talk very regularly with the President. And to go to what Don had been saying, I mean, there's an area where the President has extensive powers, and it's the job of the Attorney General to support those things. On the other hand, while I spoke to President Bush very often and certainly carried out his policies with regard to what became Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, I had a similar relationship with President Clinton. There were things that happened during the Clinton administration that unfortunately, they were unfortunate things that I had to be involved in, like Waco and the first World Trade Center bombing, which at least had a felicitous ending, if not a good beginning. And with regard to those things, I spoke very regularly to President Clinton, almost daily, and tried as well as I could, even though I was of the opposite party, to achieve the goals of his administration within the context of what I thought the law was. And I didn't hesitate to raise caveats when, for example, President Clinton asked me to obtain the support of the Department of Defense to use heavy equipment and large weapons in the Waco compound and deal with posse comitatus questions. They're going to come up again in the next Trump administration. But there were times where I said no, and that I'd been involved in certain things. The Haitian case that went to the Supreme Court, a very fine attorney in the Solicitor General's office, Maureen Mahoney, had just written the brief. I had a hand in it, and I said, I don't want to change our position, and lobbied very heavily with the president. And I said, well, you know, look, let me do what I'm doing. If you want to change policy after I'm gone, go ahead and do that. But for now, if you don't like it, just blame me. And we reached agreement. We reached agreement on that, and a number of these things come up. And I'm saying all of this not just to reiterate history, but to suggest what the conundrum is with regard to the current apparent nominee to be the Attorney General. President Trump has a very different view of what the Department of Justice ought to be, different from either of the Bushes, who I knew quite well, or from President Clinton, who I also served for a time. And the question is not whether the president can deal regularly and speak regularly and even direct the Attorney General, but whether, as General Gonzalez suggested, the president ought to be initiating investigations, controlling the outcomes of those investigations, intermediating in sentencing decisions, things along those lines. We know what Donald Trump is likely to do because he's done it. And the same thing is true, I think Bob Bauer has left, but Bob mentioned the National Emergencies Act. Well, it's always been an issue. I've been involved in it for years, but Larry Tribe at Harvard Law School and I represented the county of El Paso, Texas, in the border wall cases. And there we were dealing with President Trump's attempts at reprogramming monies that were intended for military bases and other things within the Department of Defense to build this benighted wall across the border. So Bob raised the question of what is likely to happen in the Clinton administration. There's no abstraction about this. In the Trump administration, we know exactly what Donald Trump is going to do because he's done it before. And the fact, I mean, I testified about the National Emergencies Act. There are scores of national emergencies. They get on the books and they go on forever. There's national emergencies that are still pending about the diamond supply in Africa. I know you think about that almost every day. There's a great need to amend the National Emergencies Act. It would do a lot to get Congress back into the fray. I mean, if there's a deficiency here, I'm very respectful of the so-called debate that we had over the role of the Supreme Court. I think the court's doing okay, and the aggrandizement of power in the executive, which started really in the 1940s, in a whole bunch of ways, even going back earlier than that to the Depression and Roosevelt. What we've seen is Congress has left the field almost entirely, and so you get cases like West Virginia and EPA, sort of a return to 1938 and anti-delegation, Schechter Poultry, things along those lines. That's the branch that we ought to be looking at, and one has to be pessimistic in terms of the rule of law, in terms of what the framers intended, what our Constitution, both the literal Constitution and kind of what Peter and others were adverting to earlier, what I've always called the common law of the Constitution, those things that are customary or mores, they're unwritten, but they're built into the history of the country, and so much of that is being subverted. But we're going to see a lot of it, and as I say, I've focused in my thinking and what I've said to you today about the relationship between the President and the Department of Justice. I'm somewhat pessimistic about it. I think you have to be, and the nature of this particular president and his nominee suggests that he's quite serious about vengeance and intervention in the day-to-day activities of the department. So it's something to watch. There are a number of rule of law issues that we've discussed in this organization, and I want to close because you have lives to live and things to do, and there's a reception with actual liquor after this, and you can partake of that. But two of the greatest political philosophers in the history of the United States, and were much in agreement with one another. One of them was Benjamin Franklin, who famously was asked by a woman after the Constitutional Convention, "What have you given us?" And famously, he said, "A republic, if you can hold it." And the other great philosopher was Walt Kelly. I'm sure you all remember Walt and Pogo, and Pogo Possum in the Okefenokee Swamp announced, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." And that's what pertains today. I mean, the current situation, we have vast divisions in our society. We have huge issues in front of us, both economic issues, worldwide issues. I'm going back to my initial point about why good people accept bad government, why there's a trend towards authoritarianism. I'm far from a Marxist. I'm a market person. But the fact of the matter is that worldwide, there are more and more people who feel dispossessed for a variety of reasons. The sort of thing that led to the Great Migration years ago, technology. In those days, it was farm equipment, but today it's things that make individual human work less necessary. And that's the sort of thing that we have to attend to. There are lots of people who opposed what I think most of the people in this room are for, but they're not bad people. We need to think about their needs, and we need to think about those needs in the context of the rule of law. Further affing it saith not. Enjoy the rest of the evening.